Support for Headline Humboldt is made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Coming up next on Headline Humboldt, a state plan to close the Mad River Fish Hatchery has inspired some local residents to fight back. We'll share those details. Also, Executive Director Wes Harrison from the North Coast Substance Abuse Council at Crossroads joins us to talk about that disease, mental health more broadly, and the destructive power of stigma in our community. Coming up now on Headline Humboldt. From the top of Humboldt Hill, this is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. This past weekend, I participated in a town hall event put on by the city of Eureka to discuss the mental health crisis and how it impacts our community. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, so the subject is both timely and important. I was on a lived experience panel to discuss my own journey through mental health issues, substance abuse, and recovery. I was joined on that panel by several others, including Leah Nagy, who has been a frequent guest on this show and has long been an advocate on these issues through her involvement with the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, or NAMI, Humboldt. Another panelist was our guest today, Wes Harrison, Executive Director of the North Coast Substance Abuse Council at Crossroads, and someone whose journey in many ways parallels my own. We had an important discussion around dispelling many of the myths that continue to plague this community in regards to mental health. Wesley's story was inspiring. However difficult our circumstances, it's always possible to get better. We have to have hope. We have to be willing to work hard, but in the end, the only limits upon our potential to grow, change, and thrive are those we put in place ourselves. Wes's story is a perfect example of such a willingness to persevere in the face of hardship, and he's since turned that recovery into a mission to help others do the same. We'll hear about both his story and the future of his work in just a moment, but first, the news. The College of the Redwoods Board of Trustees has decided to maintain its official position in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion priorities in spite of the political risk that may entail. CR President Keith Flamer had proposed a resolution for this week's board meeting that would have rescinded 6 resolutions over the past several years that have recognized an inclusive environment against racism, Women's History Month, hate against Asian Americans, CR's commitment to DEI, its support for undocumented students, and Campus Pride Month. But officials decided to remove the resolution before the meeting occurred. It was intended to be a preventative measure against the Trump administration's wrath, which it has demonstrated repeatedly now against numerous institutions by cutting funding and other resources. Molly Blakemore, CR's Director of Marketing and Communication, told the Lost Coast Outpost this week that Flamer believes that the, quote, work we've done, coupled with the various legal challenges and process, unquote, are enough to protect CR from the federal government. Board members issued the following statement at the meeting. Quote, we will not allow external political forces to dictate what our faculty-trained scholars and disciplinary experts are permitted to teach, research, or discuss. The right to explore ideas, challenge assumptions, and pursue truth is not only protected, but also essential to the mission of higher education and a functioning democracy. In response to a decision by the state to close the Mad River Fish Hatchery, local supporters are mounting an effort to fight. More than 2,000 signatures have been collected as of earlier this week. Launched by local fishing guide Tyler Belvin on change.org, the petition demands that state officials reverse the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's decision to shutter the hatchery. Located just outside of Blue Lake, the hatchery has long been a North Coast favorite pastime destination for over half a century. In its announcement of the closure, the state pointed to the hatchery's limited fish production, extensive maintenance needs, and increased regulatory burdens as key reasons for the decision. It is estimated that the facility would require at least $1 million annually to stay open, as is, to maintain current operations, and then tens of millions more in repairs to modernize infrastructure and comply with federal standards. As California grapples with a statewide budget crisis, CDFW officials seemingly concluded that resources would be better invested elsewhere. Belvin and others argue that the hatchery's value goes far beyond tourism. To view or sign the petition, visit change.org and search for Save Mad River Fish Hatchery. In yet another public swipe at public broadcasting, President Donald Trump last week signed an executive order aiming to slash public subsidies to PBS and NPR for allegedly being biased against his administration. The order instructs the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and other federal agencies to cease federal funding for NPR and PBS, and further requires that they work to root out indirect sources of public financing for the news organizations. The White House said on social media that the outlets receive millions from taxpayers to spread, quote, a radical woke propaganda disguised as news. PBS and NPR get roughly $500 million in public money through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and have been preparing for the possibility of stiff cuts since Trump's elections, as Republicans have long complained about them. Paula Kerger, PBS CEO and president, said in a statement last month that the Trump administration's effort to rescind funding for public media would disrupt the essential service PBS and local member stations provide to the American people. Heat is a PBS station. We'll be right back after this short break.
My art is my voice.
There's a lot working against the process of life right now.
I really wanted to be able to do something greater with our art.
Telling a story, an emotional problem that I have come across, and how I try to overcome that using art.
And that reading poetry. You have finally broken the barrier of not speaking your truth and you were doing it.
Tuesday evening at 8 on Keat HD.
Keat PBS invites you to feel the funk. Join us Saturday, May 17th at 7 p.m. at the Arcadia Playhouse for a free screening of We Want the Funk, a powerful new documentary from Emmy winner Stanley Nelson and Grammy-nominated co-director Nicole London. The film traces the vibrant history of funk music and its role in cultural change. Then get on your feet for a live concert with Claire Bent and Citizen Funk. It's a night of film, music, and community you won't forget. Register now at keat.org.
Joining us now in studio is Wes Harrison from the North Coast Substance Abuse Council at Crossroads. I can't talk today, man. Sorry about that.
It's okay. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So you do fantastic work. We had the pleasure this past weekend of both speaking on a lived experience panel at the town hall meeting to talk about mental health issues, and in particular to talk about stigma and other myths that are plaguing the mental health issue. As part of that, I got to hear your story, and it was inspiring, and in a lot of ways sort of parallels my own. But let's talk about your story. You're the head of Crossroads now, which is a rehab facility. How did you get from the life before to working at Crossroads, and what was that life before, if you don't mind talking about it?
Well, I think starting at the beginning would be prevalent. I am the child of a schizophrenic mother who was my sole provider in Del Norte County. Growing up with her very strongly shaped my perception of society and community. There was a lot of stigma involved in growing up. There was a lot of dangerous situations that I found myself in, being the child of a schizophrenic who couldn't manage her own care, let alone the care of a child. It was that very experience that led me to pull back from society as a whole. Most of my life I was trained to not speak to people, to view society as a threat, because that's the way my mother viewed it. Because had systems of care gotten involved, I would have been removed from her care. Yeah. So it was more of a survival instinct of hers to pull back and isolate. So that's what we did most of my childhood. When I moved on from being with my mother after family members stepped in and intervened, that same perception of society as a threat still existed within my life. The complex post-traumatic stress disorder that came with it, the generalized anxiety disorder, the major depressive disorders were all ingrained into me as a child, which very quickly and easily led me down the road of substance use disorder. Yeah. Introduced multiple chemical substances and alcohol throughout my life. Very quickly became addicted. Met my wife, who also has some similar mental health struggles along the way, and together we kind of trauma bonded. And she had a very similar isolative view on community and society. So when we found each other, we withdrew from society together and stayed out of the sight of our community. We had children in addiction. And so again, the self-preservation kicks in. The self-preservation that I was taught as a child kicked in with her. And we tried to remain as a whole family unit while also experiencing substance use disorder. And I can't tell you the amount of utter threat you feel under at all times, because you have this problem that you can't manage, that you can't get a hold of, that you can't control, and at the same time you have these precious children in your care that you're trying to make sure they're okay. You know you need help, but you know that the moment you reach out for help, you're probably going to lose those children. At least that's what's been ingrained. Throughout that process, we got involved with child welfare. They stepped in, steered us in the direction of treatment. First push was towards residential treatment, and of course, having a family. Going to residential treatment is probably one of the biggest commitments anyone who is experiencing substance use disorder can possibly agree to. We actually didn't agree to residential treatment. We leaned into outpatient. Luckily for us, the motivation was there, and I can't tell you how important having that motivation is for recovery, because we engaged in outpatient services here in the county. We went through treatment and got clean together, which was an amazing story. I should
Not
tell
very
you.
common. No, it's rare.
Yeah, it truly is. And the strangest thing about it is the location in which we were living was actually the Flamingo Hotel as a family, and that's where we got clean.
Yeah.
The managers of the hotel had actually taken a liking to our family, and when they found out what we were going through, they wrapped around us and helped keep us accountable. And so when we were living at the Flamingo Hotel, which is notorious for its past histories of drug activity that happens there, along with multiple other motels that were here in Humboldt County, it was definitely not the ideal environment to get sober in, but it was the environment we had. So we got clean and sober there, and then we, of course, joined a church. That church wrapped around us. That is the Eureka Seventh-day Adventist Church. And then through all of that, the inspiration of going into the helping field is what was born when you access care from loving providers, people that have empathy and understanding and compassion for you. All of a sudden, when you start getting a hold of what you're dealing with, you start thinking, I would like to do for someone else what someone has done for me today. Yeah. And it was that inspiration that led me to apply at North Coast Substance Abuse Council as the administrative assistant. And it was in that process, working there, that we ended up going through a couple key agency changes through my first 2 years, where I was promoted from administrative assistant to intake coordinator to acting administrator to then executive director for what I am now.
Yeah. And you've seen quite a bit of change, as you mentioned, that when you took over, it was under threat. What did that threat look like, and how did you guys get through that?
Oh, absolutely. So in 2014, when I first came on, we're going to call that time period the funding drought for residential treatment programs in Humboldt County. All three programs, that was ADCS, Humboldt Recovery, and Crossroads, all received their funding through various contracts with probation or county. And those dollars were very minimal. I can tell you that when I started working at Crossroads, the county rate for a bed night was $55. It was cheaper to stay at Crossroads than it was to go to Motel 6.
Yeah.
Right? So imagine trying to run a 20-bed facility on $55 a night, and being told by our funders that funding is drying up and that we have to figure out a way to all exist, provide services on the dollars allotted. So at the time, we were negotiating with ADCS about a potential merge in the past. So there was a potential merge. State guidelines about services make it really difficult to license a facility. And in that gap of having to push against the state, we actually decided as an agency to continue on. So we went through an almost merge, and then we decided to stay as our own independent agency because there were these potentials of new funding sources coming through. They were extremely far-fetched funding sources that required miracles of county work to happen in order to obtain and maintain, but we decided to give it a gamble and shoot for that funding source.
And
And we managed to actually put together the DMC ODS, that's Drug Medi-Cal Organized Delivery System regional model here in Northern California.
Which was the first time that had ever been done.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right? So the prevention for funding sources for residential was in Southern California. DMC ODS had been implemented in single counties where you have a full continuum of services. That's detox, residential, outpatient, right? So Medi-Cal would pay for those fundings, right? So residential was funded by Medi-Cal dollars down there. Up here, it wasn't happening because we were too small of a county. So we had to create a pool of beneficiaries large enough to make the system worth building.
Yeah.
But that meant putting all 7 counties in the Northern California region.
Because they're all small rural counties,
Yes.
and by doing that, you get big enough.
Absolutely.
But that's complex, and no one's done it before.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right? Because what most people don't understand about Medi-Cal benefits is county to county, they're not transferable. My Humboldt County Medi-Cal benefits do not work in Los Angeles County, right? My Los Angeles County benefits don't work up here. There is an entirely different process and difficult process that you have to undergo to be able to switch over county services. Most people have to do an inter-county transfer that takes 60 days, and everybody knows how vital 60 days of waiting can be when you're searching for recovery.
Yeah.
So what we managed to do is we put together a system called the Wellness Benefit through Partnership Health. And that Wellness Benefit created a funding stream that allowed for a person that's in Siskiyou County, Shasta County, Modoc County, Trinity County, Humboldt County, any one of those counties in the regional model, to be able to still be a resident of that county, come to our county, receive services, and then go back to their county without ever dropping coverage.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Absolutely ingenious plan there. And I think that, things have looked up since in terms of people getting recovery. I know that when I was trying to get clean, it was almost impossible to find an open bed that I could afford if you didn't have a court referral, and that since has changed. But you talk a lot about Medi-Cal. Do you foresee any difficulties with the changes that have been going on in Washington, D.C. in terms of funding for Medi-Cal? Can the downstream effects of that impact what you guys are doing? Are you concerned about that? What do you see?
So I have absolute concerns, especially when it comes to our beneficiaries here in Humboldt County. We are blessed, as far as a state goes, to have our Medi-Cal funding being half funded by Medicaid and half funded by our own general fund.
Okay.
So there is a buffer that our state allows us. My major concerns when I heard the $880 billion cuts coming from the Energy Commission, I was very concerned. I have looked at those numbers and have determined that the $880 billion is a 10-year number, which means they're looking to cut $88 billion overall. The overall national Medicaid budget is $680 billion a year, right? And Medicare is $840 billion a year. If they were to cut half of what they needed for the $88 billion from Medicaid and Medicare alone, that would drop Medicaid down to $640 and drop Medicaid down to $800, which means there's still dollars there. My major concern is what they're going to do to beneficiaries. I don't think services, as far as Medi-Cal services, are being cut. As far as providers and direct services, I think eligibility numbers are going to be altered. I think people that once qualified for these services won't qualify anymore. And I think when they don't hit those numbers, that they will drop the poverty threshold in order to hit and maintain those numbers. So I am concerned about who can receive those services.
Frightening time in that regard. There's a lot I want to talk about. When we were giving the presentation this past weekend, we talked a lot about stigma, and you had some passionate things to say about that. Can you talk a little bit about stigma in general and how that can keep people from getting clean and complicate their healing process, and then also how stigma impacted your efforts to expand your facility and open a new place in Henderson Center? You've since managed to, sort of ameliorate that situation, but that was initially an obstacle. Talk about stigma. How does that impact people's recovery?
Stigma really is the invisible wall and is the silent oppressor to the vulnerable people who are looking for help. It is the quiet voice inside our heads that tell us don't reach out of fear of judgment. It is what we experience when we talk about, in a public form and fashion, about the problems our community experiences. So when we talk about homelessness, drug addiction, mental health, people openly express their disdain for these populations, and people that are experiencing these issues see publicly those reactions. I can tell you I spend quite a bit of time in comment sections, making sure I am understanding the public's perception on how they view the people I serve, right? Because I was a person who experienced that stigma and that judgment. Stigma is the first thing you must overcome when seeking help, because in the AA rooms they talk about the 1,000-pound phone, right? Reaching out for help is probably the hardest thing to do. I think we as a society are responsible for the weight of that reaching out. We are active participants, and then we also spend a lot of times arguing with each other, and often even our biggest defenders of our population often dehumanize the population we're serving in the way we defend. So I always encourage people to look at the way we are communicating about the populations we serve or wanting to help, because folks are seeing both sides of the argument and are definitely internalizing the entire thing. Stigma on a grand scale is widely experienced. Stigma in specific to the project that we put together.
First, what is that project?
So that project is our 309 Harris Street expansion of 12 female beds. That project is going to be a brand new program that is going to be female-centered with a focus on pregnant women, because we want to be able to offer a completely female-centered program that is gender-specific to the needs of women and mothers-to-be in a district that is very close to female reproductive health centers and things like that. So that is what the project will be. Currently, right now, we operate a co-ed program on Myrtle, which is men and women. But being entirely honest, we run a men's program that women participate in. It's not really centered on gender, and there's a lot of subjects that we can't touch on or discuss because there is two genders. Being able to separate the genders allows us to get really focused in on what specifically each gender needs in regards to treatment.
And when you're dealing with trauma with people who have gone through a lot in their lives, it's very important that people can feel like they're open to talk about some of the experiences in their lives, and that can be hard in a mixed gender setting, correct?
Oh, absolutely. One of our treatment models is we do a codependency workbook, and in that codependency workbook, it talks a lot about like relational roles, and it's one of our most interesting groups because we'll have both men and women in our group room talking about their roles in relationships, and then it'll spark debate and go back and forth. We'll go back and forth between who takes responsibility for what. And it's interesting, but it's going to be great to be able to separate those two genders. But when we first proposed that project, it was specific to not identify what gender, because you can't discriminate based on gender with city planning and all of those things. So we left that off the table. It was just for 12 beds. The first response was, we don't want to rehab here. We don't want to rehab here. And I expected that, right? Because I don't ask anybody to just open their doors without doing their research, without getting to know us, right? I wanted the opportunity to be able to meet people. That's why we did our conditional use permit application before I even bought the house. So we started that public process very early on so we can engage with the community. And the community responded when they first thought it to be men who were going to be receiving care in that area as a fear response, right? They thought that the problems coming with a drug rehab coming to their community were going to be the same as problems that come with the drug community. There wasn't a separation between the recovery community and those experiencing active addiction, right? So we had to dispel a lot of those myths. We got through the first planning commission with an approval. We had I believe a 4-1 vote on that one, and then the appeal happened. And in the appeal is when I decided I was going to let the community know exactly the gender population,
plans,
right? And when I openly expressed that it was for women and pregnant women, the amount of change that happened in the room, right? Which is telling in a lot of ways of how men experience stigma in this population. But I am glad that they got to hear specifically so they can become in agreement with it. And they felt that it was more appropriate, knowing that the new Dr. Stokes Women's Health Program was opening up, that we're down the street from Healthy Moms, that it would be a lot more welcome in their neighborhood. So I'm glad that we watched hearts and minds change, and we actually went from a 4-1 vote to a unanimous 5-0 vote.
Yeah, and I think that the community seems like maybe it was more invested in this idea, which says something about stigma, and that's unfortunate, but in the long run you're getting this program going and people will be able to see that it's not disruptive, but maybe even helps build the community, which I think is an important part of this. You know, you mentioned trauma. I know that I've had trauma in my own life in terms of having a schizophrenic parent like you, although he wasn't my sole caregiver, and that's a huge caveat. Stigma and trauma kind of go hand in hand, and they make it so that people who have undergone trauma and therefore have the mental health issues that coincide with that, they're afraid to get help. Can you talk a little bit about the role of trauma in your own story and how trauma often informs why people get into addiction cycles in the first place?
So trauma really becomes deeply ingrained in your psyche and your perception, which turns into behavioral patterns, right? So when a person experiences childhood trauma, right, it is absolutely shapes the way their brain produces chemicals, right? It hardwires us to fight or flight, right? Cortisol levels go up, which is the stress response, right? Which means we're always ready to run, right? And if we're not ready to run, we're ready to fight. So what happens is these brain chemical systems are locked in for most of our childhood, and then we hit adulthood. And then the first time that we end up in a situation, which are common because we are experiencers of trauma, where we end up in dangerous situations or exposed situations where we're exposed to substances, the first time we ingest that substance, the chemical reaction that happens in our brain is almost life-changing, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, I feel good or confident or able to talk or brave.
Yeah.
Or all of a sudden, all my nerves and pain have gone away.
It's like the best thing that's ever happened.
It's just, it is no mystery to me why these substances are so addictive, because they work so well at what they do.
Yeah.
And you can't replicate that. You can't talk someone away from that and convince them not to. When you're a child of trauma and you experience that euphoria, and then you introduce them to a subculture that is okay with that behavior, that accepts them, all of a sudden you've stuck somebody in a cycle that keeps them away from society, and everybody's trauma just continues to justify everybody else's trauma, right?
Yep.
And then it begins to enable dangerous behaviors, right? And then all of a sudden you're on the streets, you know, and then you're stealing, and then you're in jail, and then it just gets deeper and deeper.
You know, we've only got a minute left, but it's interesting to me that if we really want to deal with the substance abuse problem in our region and everywhere else, we have to get better at intercepting people when they're getting out of trauma, preventing trauma, but doing a better job of managing people's mental health and keeping them from getting in those positions where they're suffering so much that the drug makes all that difference. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming in. I appreciate you telling your story. Crossroads has done wonderful work for a lot of people, and I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure being out here and telling it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, folks. I appreciate you watching the show, and we'll see you again next week on Friday. Stay tuned. Stay informed.